So we were talking about how the Federal Reserve started and when it started, but can you tell us a little bit about why the public favor was for banking reform? What preceded the Federal Reserve to have the act accepted at all?
Sure. So the thing the listeners need to know is that the Federal Reserve was not the first central bank in the United States. It was, depending on your definition, it was either the third or the fourth. And, through U.S. history, there was two. One was called the Bank of the United States and then the Second Bank of the United States. And the Second Bank of the United States, famously, it had its charter wasn't renewed by President Andrew Jackson, and he ran a very populist campaign in his reelection to sort of, run against the bank, and he was, calling it a many-headed monster and things like that, referring to Greek mythology. So he was really running against the moneyed Wall Street interest and trying to show the people against the bank. So that actually was killed. He didn't renew the charter, and it eventually just faded away. And then what would happen is, though, that remember the private banking system, it's not 100% reserves. Meaning when you go in and put, in our time, if you go into the bank and you deposit $100 into your checking account, they don't just take that and go put it in a drawer somewhere with your name on it. They lend most of that back out to somebody else. And so that's why
banks have been doing that since banking sort of got underway. They've been
right. I mean, that goes back to the goldsmiths when people would deposit some of their gold with them, and they'd give them a ticket, like a claim ticket, and then they realized after a while, why are we sitting on all this gold when no one claims it? Why don't we lend it out and make some money? So yeah, I mean that's why banks are susceptible to a bank run, and that's not a feature of banking per se. That's a feature of what's called fractional reserve banking. So if the banks really did just store your money like a warehouse and then just give you a claim ticket and then maybe charge you a nominal service fee for the the privilege of building a nice safe vault and having guards and cameras and things like that and setting up ATMs throughout the country, that would be a business model, and then the bank wouldn't be susceptible to a bank run. Just like somebody who runs a storage facility where college kids put their couches and chairs and stuff over the summer when they go back home, the person who runs that isn't worried about a run where, what if everyone shows up on the same day and wants to get their furniture out, because it's sitting safely in storage, right? So The reason banks are worried about a run, the reason a bank can be brought to its knees is because it's lent out the money that people have on deposit. So that always happens, and that was what the function of centralized banking was supposed to be, was to be a so-called lender of last resort. And so in 1907, again, this was right before the Fed, the banks got into trouble. The specific trigger was the Knickerbocker Trust, was a big banking trust in New York City, and for whatever reason, rumors, some people claim that a competitor deliberately started a rumor. We don't know exactly, but for whatever reason, the public got spooked, and they started lining up, just down the street and around the corners and so forth to get their money out of this place. And by definition, if it's a fractional reserve bank, it can't satisfy all of its depositors if they all want their money at the same time. So that bank crashed, and then it was, there was a worry that, if the public gets spooked and they all want to get their money out of all the banks, we're doomed. And so J.P. Morgan came in. He worked out a deal with the U.S. Treasury Secretary. They both kicked in money, and J.P. Morgan kind of arranged a bailout, if you will, of all the private banks to sort of stem the panic. And so the idea is if one particular bank's in trouble, some other healthy bank that's not getting hit with a run can lend reserves to the bank that's in trouble. And so that way, they can move the reserves around that the system has to sort of fend off the runs to try to calm the public and show them, see, we can pay you off if you want, and that gets the public to relax. And so the bankers didn't like that because they said, this is crazy that we're relying on J.P. Morgan bailing us out. And then there was a very systematic effort, and this is the best book for all this is The Creature from Jekyll Island. I mean, there is some sort of conspiracy stuff in there, but I mean, in terms of just the history of what happened, that's the single best book I've come across.
Yeah, from
just showing that all
the point in history where the regulators are going from bank to bank and they're literally moving the gold from bank to bank to beat them.
Right. Yeah, that happened like all the sort of what was called the wildcat banks in the Wild West and so forth. That the bank, you're right. The government regulators would go from bank to check to see the reserves, and then they'd look at one bank, and then when the guy got on his horse, they would put the reserves on a faster horse and get to the next bank before he got there, and put the same money in the vault. But so yeah, that's what these private bank interests were doing. I mean, this is what's so funny is people think that the investment bankers, these huge bankers, don't like the government, and they say, oh, no, leave us alone, we want to be unregulated. But that wasn't true at all.
Mm-hmm.
That what happened is it was these huge private bankers who wrote the Federal Reserve Act for all intents and purposes, and they pushed through the campaign. So they couldn't do it directly. In public, they had to make it look like they were chafing under all this government oversight. But behind the scenes, they were the ones funding these so-called progressive groups, in the early 1900s who were calling for greater regulation of the wildcat free market. And the reason, in case people are wondering, why the heck would a private banker want more regulation, it's because the Fed would then be the lender of last resort, and the Fed would basically set up a cartel so all the banks could be synchronized, and so they could all inflate their deposits and their loans, in unison. And then if they ever got in trouble, if the system as a whole got in trouble, the Fed was there to bail them all out, just like has happened
Right.
in more recent times.
And that's what Murray Rothbard calls holding hands and inflating together. The whole banking system can now hold hands and inflate together. So if one bank is short on cash, they can just easily lend to one another, and if those other banks aren't willing to do it through the Fed funds market, then the Fed steps in and does it?
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying is true, but what Rothbard has in mind there is, if there weren't a Federal Reserve, it was just all the banks in a literally open free market, they could, so individual banks could try to lend out more some of their reserves and not keep 100% in the vault. But the problem is, if their competitors were more conservative, so if you had one bank that only had like 20% reserves, and their competitors had 80 or 90% of the money in reserve in the vault, the idea is the customers of the real reckless bank, when they would go around town writing checks, those checks would accumulate with the real conservative bankers, would get deposited in their accounts. And so the banks periodically would have a clearinghouse operation where each bank would settle up with each other and say, okay, my clients have written $2 million in checks drawn on your clients' accounts, and your clients have only written, $1.8 million drawn on mine, so that means you owe me $200,000 in cash to settle up. And so the idea is if one bank is real reckless and starts inflating when its competitors don't, that's going to come back to bite it really quickly. All those checks are going to come back, and it's going to have to drain its vault to its competitors. So that would keep it in check. So the idea is if all the banks could form an agreement with each other and say, let's not be stupid here. Why don't we all just be reckless and inflate at the same time, and then it'll sort of offset each other. And then they could do that. But the problem is, a cartel in a free market is hard to enforce. Some rival would come in and then be more conservative and steal all their reserves. So that's what Rothbard is saying, is what the Fed does is it comes in as sort of like a policeman and enforces the whole cartel.
I see.
So it allows the banks to inflate more than they would under a free market where competition would, quickly nip that in the bud.
Okay. So what does the Fed do by setting the federal funds rate so low? Is that how they help the whole banking system inflate simultaneously?
Well, that's related. I mean, whatever the Fed funds rate is, it does synchronize. The existence of the Fed and the fact that all the banks are falling under the umbrella of the Fed sort of synchronizes them. But specifically with the federal funds rate, the way that works is that the federal funds rate is the interest rate that banks charge each other for loans of reserves. And so reserves are either actual cash or reserves that are on deposit with the Fed. And so when the Fed sets that rate, it's a little bit confusing. It's not that the Federal Reserve itself is lending money at the Fed funds rate. It's just the Fed can affect the total amount of reserves in the system,
Right.
And since it can control the supply, it can indirectly control the price of those loans.
I guess
So-
ultimately we also have to realize that the reserves that we're now talking about aren't gold. Since 33, it's purely dollar bills. Is that right? Did that happen in 33, or did that happen after 33?
Even though that's a little subtle. So in 1933, the crucial thing there was when the private citizens could no longer turn in their dollar bills for gold. So that was a crucial turning point. But then there still was other central bankers could exchange their money. And after World War II, there was the Bretton Woods Agreement, where basically it was the U.S. dollar still tied itself to gold, $35 an ounce, and then all the other central banks sort of used dollar bills as their reserves. So the idea was from after World War II, for a few decades there under Bretton Woods, technically the dollar was still tied to gold. It was just you had to be an important person, like another government or a central bank, to have that privilege, whereas private citizens couldn't. But then in 1971, Richard Nixon even stopped that. So it was in 1971 when Richard Nixon said, okay, even central banks now, if you turn over dollar bills to us, you're not getting any gold. So it was in 1971 where the dollar became truly a fiat currency, meaning there was nothing backing it up. So you're right. At this point now, when we talk about reserves, what that means, like a particular bank, if it has $1 million in reserves, all that means is that the Federal Reserve's computer system has, 1 million in the Excel spreadsheet or whatever their system is, saying that's how much you have on deposit with us. It doesn't mean anything. It's just an electronic entry. When Ben Bernanke writes a check and buys $1 million of assets to, inject more reserves into the system, that it's not like there's some pile of money somewhere that he's drawing down. When the Fed buys stuff, when it writes a check, that's just drawn on thin air. It's a bookkeeping entry. He just says, okay, now, if he buys $1 million in bonds from some private person, that person now has $1 million more in his checking account, just magically, and the Fed now owns those bonds. So, it's like the Fed has a printing press, but they don't even bother with the formality of printing up green pieces of paper. They just do it all electronically.
And it just draws down on the value of every other dollar that was already out there.
Well, right, exactly. There's no such thing as a free lunch. They can't just go around buying stuff with no ramifications, like you say. The problem is they're creating more dollars every time they do that, and then, yes, other things equal. If you're creating more dollars, that means the prices of everything measured in dollars is going to go up.
Okay, well, I'm going to interrupt you one more time, and we're going to head to break.